They do these tests like that back to back.
And wall balls.
Let's see.
Well, next week is going
All
to
right,
be
Sherry, you're all set.
tons of bench marks, but they're all short.
Yeah, it
Like
is.
Fran.
All right, so good morning. How'd you guys all sleep last night?
Great when I got to bed.
Okay, so well, I first want to say thanks to Phil, thanks to Jordan for inviting me to talk today. We're going to walk you through a little bit about how sleep impacts athletic performance. Please feel free to ask questions, stop me midway through. I kind of broke this up to be sort of half research focused, to walk you through some of the literature and just so you have a sense of why is this whole thing important. And then also sort of the second half kind of transitioning into, okay, what does that mean in terms of application to athletes? What does that sort of look like in terms of integrating that into a high school, college, or pro team? So, we'll get started. Okay, so the first question I have for you guys is, are you ever tired or are your athletes ever tired? But more importantly, do they actually know how that affects their athletic performance? Right? So let's say you injure your quad, right? And you have your athlete run a sprint. They're clearly going to probably run the sprint slower because they obviously relate the injury to how they're performing, right? It's pretty straightforward. But if you take an athlete and say they get not their typical 8 hours of sleep, but now they're getting, say, 6 hours of sleep for the last couple of days, are they going to realize how that affects their reaction time? Are they going to know how that affects their weightlifting when they're training? Are they going to realize how that affects their endurance? It's going to be a little bit harder for them to tell. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to walk you through just a little bit of the research to support why this whole sleep thing really is critical for an athlete, and also make the argument that I really believe if your athlete is not being well rested and recovering well, not just during season, but in the preseason and even in advance of the regular season to start, that they're really not optimizing their performance. All right, so to give you sort of a roadmap to where we're going, I'm going to start with just a little bit of background. What does chronic sleep loss do and what does that affect? I'm going to show you a little bit of some of the research I do with a lot of the Stanford athletes. Specifically, I do the extension of sleep, so trying to reverse the deprivation effects that we see that's so prevalent amongst all of our athletes. And then a couple of strategies, okay, what can we do to get athletes actually better rested, tangibly, what does that mean for tonight? 10 things that they can do. And then at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about sleep monitors. There's a lot of technology that's come and emerged in the last couple of years that has made this more accessible to a lot of athletes to be able to monitor objectively how they're sleeping. Because what you tell me subjectively is critical information, but I can tell you how that compares to objective measures is vastly different. And then some other considerations in terms of a basic framework on how this may look like in terms of applying it to some athletes. And I'll leave some time for questions and answers because I know that that's obviously something that I may not get to touch on all the different topics in this short amount of time. Any questions actually before we get going? Okay, so to give you a little bit of my background, I'm at Stanford under the Sleep Disorders Clinic and Research Laboratory. I've been under Dr. Dement for the last 11 years. This is the guy. He's considered the founding father of sleep medicine. So you guys, here's your sleep stages. You guys have learned about different stages, perhaps, the basics. He's the guy that discovered REM sleep and discovered all the different architecture of it. So he's been an awesome mentor. And my research has really focused on how does sleep duration, sleep quality affect how elite athletes perform. And then over the last couple of years, I started to work with different college and professional teams to really integrate and implement what we understand from the sleep science, from circadian rhythm studies, how the body clock works to really work to optimize performance at home and on the road for teams. Okay, so this is clearly an oversimplification, but there's a lot of components to sports performance, right? And I think we'll all agree that coaching plays a big role, nutrition, what goes into your body, what goes out of your body, the training, strength and conditioning, sports psychology, PT. But I'm going to make the argument that sleep affects all of these different assets of how an athlete's going to perform. I'm sure you guys have all seen it, right? The grumpy kid that comes in super exhausted, he's not going to lift well, he's not going to train well, he's definitely not going to have the high enough endurance that he typically would if we're well rested, right? So it really is foundational. And the interesting thing is, whenever I've talked to most athletes, again, this goes all the way from the high school level all the way up to the pros, and I ask, what is it that your coach or your trainer has told you about sleep? Oftentimes they look at me, they kind of laugh, and they just say, Sherry, I don't know, they told me to get a good night's rest before a game. And that's pretty much the extent of it. That may not be the case in all teams and organizations, but I would say that I encounter that more often than not. It's just simply the prescription to get a good night's rest. And I'll argue that it's not just one night or even one weekend of good sleep that's going to make a difference. It's really making it a high priority every single day. And some of the research I'll show you is looking at what does that look like over several weeks, several months of a period. Okay, so the bottom line is you have to charge up your batteries, right? You use your batteries during the day, they get depleted, you have to charge them back up at nighttime. And this is obviously critical for physical recovery, muscle regen, repair, learning and memory, skill consolidation, all these things you need to have sleep. And it's not just sleep after a lot of these training periods, but it's also, for example, it's needing to sleep beforehand. So there's research on like learning and memory where it's not just post learning new information or new skills, but you need to have that adequate rest before, or else you're not going to have the same recovery and recall for that. Obviously, it's important for energy alertness, and I like to point out too is it potentially can reduce injuries and improve the longevity of someone's career, because there is a difference working with athletes who are, say, 21 and young rookies versus working with some of the vets, right? Where they start to recognize that the recovery and regen is a more critical aspect down the road when they're not 21 anymore. So what does it mean? What does this chronic sleep loss do to you? So I'm talking about not just sleep deprivation, you're pulling in all night or not sleeping all night. This is just getting less sleep than your body requires. So you need a certain amount of sleep every night. And when you don't meet that, you come and build up a deficit, okay? So this affects submax maximal lifting. This was an interesting study done where they saw a drop in, both submax maximal lifting. I think this was in like bench press, leg press, deadlift. And they saw a drop as much as even within 4 days of getting a shorter amount of sleep, you're dropping their lift by 20 pounds, which is pretty incredible.
What was that relative percentage?
Sorry?
The 20 pounds, what was the relative percentage? Because that 20 pounds could be very significant or insignificant depending on what your max is.
Yeah, I don't know what the max is. I can provide the literature and we can look at specific.
I'd be curious to see that.
Yeah, because 20 pounds is nothing to you. Basically, is what you're saying.
And you have 100 pound max, that's huge. But if you have a 400 pound max, it's not as drastic.
Male college students that were weightlifters, was my understanding. But I can look that up and get back to you for that. There's a delay in audio and visual reaction time. So how critical is 1/10 of a second, right? I would argue that that's important to be quick on your feet in any type of sport.
Is that how much it was? The 10?
No, but I've seen there's some reaction studies where they're doing psychomotor vigilance tasks and there are drops in it.
And most of them use that psychomotor test that you use, right? On where they're trying to hit dots on the PDA.
Yeah, and I'll show some of that data up there too.
Cool.
And then there's also impaired motor functioning, and this is an interesting study I throw up just because it's interesting to highlight that it's not just total deprivation. Sure, you can go one full night and you'll perform at the same level as someone who's legally intoxicated, but you can also perform at that same level if you're just getting less sleep than you need over multiple days. Yeah, and then if you pull that out to 10 days of 4 to 5 hours, that's as if you stood up for 2 nights straight, and you'll perform at that same level, which is pretty substantial. Okay, it affects fatigue levels, energy levels, reduces endurance. Your athletes are going to feel like they're going to be working a lot harder. So they're going to hit the wall a lot faster, and they're going to feel like they're putting out so much more effort when they can still perform at the same level. It's just that they have this added weight of being chronically sleep restricted. And then there was an interesting study by a colleague of mine at UCSF that looked at adolescent athletes. And the one variable that he found that was related to fatigue-related injuries was that these adolescents were getting less than 6 hours of sleep the night before, or the several nights before these injuries did occur. All right, so there's lots of research. I'd be happy to go through all of the effects because it really affects everything for an athlete, but I'm just highlighting a couple of them that I think are really relevant. It also affects glucose metabolism. It's huge, by 30 to 40%. It obviously affects your appetite levels. Ghrelin and leptin get mixed up when you have chronic sleep restriction. The choices that athletes make in terms of their nutrition go down. I'm sure you guys have also seen that too. When you're chronically sleep deprived, you end to grab for more carbs and fatty foods, and you're eating at very different times that are not good for your circadian rhythms. And kind of that vicious cycle goes on and on. There's obviously critical hormones that are released during the nighttime. So growth hormone is released the biggest pulse in deep sleep, and you get that often in the first couple of hours of the night. When you're sleep restricted, sometimes that pulse is minimized, sometimes it's split, sometimes it's not even there. Other things are also critical, but I think that's one that often a lot of athletes ask about. And then things like cortisol can even shoot up with 1 week of chronic sleep restriction too.
Do you get a second round of deep sleep, or is it mostly during that first couple hours?
No, so you cycle. So
Right.
I'll go back to that.
But the biggest pulse.
The biggest pulse is in the first part of the
Right.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to touch on different topics here because this is a very broad area, but in terms of body clock, circadian rhythms are really critical because it can affect health performance outcomes. And it looks like some of you guys have seen this study before. So this was done by a colleague of mine, and it highlights just why your body clock is important. They looked at 1970 to 1995, and you took Monday night football games, East Coast versus West Coast matchups, right? Only East Coast, West Coast matchups. If you took those 25 years and you simply bet on the West Coast team, you would beat the Las Vegas point spread 68% of the time, which is ridiculously high, right? There's nothing else that's going to give you a bigger split than that. And it was really fascinating because it really demonstrates that 3-hour time difference has a big effect on how you perform. And what this also highlights is that so many times I've asked different coaches, but I've also specifically asked some NFL coaches, like, why do you fly at Friday at 2 p.m. wherever you're going in around the country? And they look back at me and they're like, I don't know, Shay, that's just what we've done for 20 years here. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's like, okay, well, there is the science to support that there's a better way. All we're trying to do is rearrange the pieces of the puzzle so it's going to physiologically maximize performance for your athletes, right? All right, so bottom line is that the body clock does make a difference. There was a circadian advantage to the West Coast team because they're playing on 3 hours earlier compared to the East Coast team. Doesn't matter if they're playing on the West Coast or the East Coast. Is that pretty clear? All right, so stay tuned. I did a follow-up study to this, and it should come out. I'm crossing my fingers next month. They've just been holding it, I think, to time it with the NFL season right now. I like this one concept because it's extremely critical that this is conveyed to your athletes because it's a topic that most have never encountered before. It's this idea of sleep debt, right? Your body needs a certain amount of sleep every night. Let's hypothetically say it's 8 hours of sleep. And there is variability, right? You've heard that 8 hours sleep. Well, no, some people need less, some people need more. But hypothetically, let's just say just 8 hours is what you need right now. If you only get 6 hours, which is probably more common for yourself, for an athlete, over the course of 5 days, you've been in debt of 2 hours each day, right? So 2 hours over the course of Monday to Friday builds up to 10 hours, right? Then let's say an athlete sleeps in on a Saturday, right? They get the time off, they sleep in. Let's hypothetically say they got 10 hours of sleep. They probably feel, a little more refreshed, a little more rejuvenated after the week. But in that bigger picture, you built up 10 hours and you slept 10 hours that Saturday, so you dropped it down 2 hours. But the reality is you got 8 left to go, right? Does that make sense? And so it's not just that one night of sleep that's going to make the difference to eliminate that debt. It's going to take you sleeping more than your body requires to get you really down to 0 sleep debt. But that's the point where I would say that you're at your peak performance. The problem is that most athletes have this huge debt built up that it's weighing you down. It's this extra added weight on top of you. So it's not that you have to sleep more indefinitely. It's just that you have to make that active effort to bring it down and then get what your body requires. Yeah? You guys on the same page? All right. So that would be the goal, right? I know it's kind of comical, but I think it makes the point. Can we get it to a small and manageable sleep debt? And that would be my goal to any athlete is to take them from wherever they are, because the reality is, I would say 95% of student athletes are sleep deprived. There's very few that are really, really well rested. And get them to the point where it's minimized. All right, so I'm jumping into some of my research quickly. Okay, I'm going to highlight just this one study, what we did with basketball. So we talked about that sleep debt reduction. Okay, I did this with athletes for 5 to 7 weeks. And I basically said, okay, for two to 4 weeks, we're going to call that your baseline. You're coming in, this is in season. Stanford basketball players are like, you think you're at your best right now, right? You're training off season, you're coming in, you're ready to go. And then we're going to try and reduce that sleep debt. So I'm going to take you from your 6 to 9 hours of sleep, just whatever they were at, and make you sleep 10 hours a night over the course of 5 to 7 weeks. And we monitored them objectively. We had them recording logs. We had them doing different test performance metrics. So that's what I'm going to show you next. So first was a sprint. This is baseline, half court, baseline, full court, and back. And then over here, this is baseline, and it's a change from baseline. So over the course of the 7-week period, we have them drop from 16.3, I think, yeah, 16.23 down to 15.5. This is an example of just one guy, but it demonstrates that while yes, there are often changes in the first week of extension, that's not the biggest difference. It's over the course of completely dropping down sleep debt over multiple weeks. And I did this in season because I wanted to include variables and stressors that are only present obviously during the competitive season. And there are variabilities between athletes, but this was at least to show you the profile of one person. Their free throws and their 3-point percentages increased by 9%. Obviously these aren't new shooting percentages for them. We have them doing 10 frees and then 5 threes, swinging the same way after every regular practice. And they did this individually after every regular practice because multiple teams was participating in the study. But we saw from the beginning of baseline to the end of sleep extension, we saw a 9% increase in both. So obviously we know sometimes things come down to one basket, and so even for them, it was an improvement. All right, I did this with football players, and I can show you a lot of other sports. I made them run combine drills after every regular practice. This is one example from one guy. This is not fresh legs, so know that when you're looking at the numbers, but we had him drop from 0.2 of a second essentially through the course of the extension period. This was an example of a 3-cone drill. And there's variability during the season, but you can obviously see the improvement and then the drop in 0.2 there. Again, there's individual differences, but we did this across a number of sports, from football, basketball, I've done baseball, swimming, volleyball, trying to look at the similarities and the differences across teams. We asked them, how do you feel, right? Like, even if it is a subjective rating, I think it's important if someone tells me I'm a 5 Sherry right now versus I feel like an 8 or a 9. I think that's very different. And so we asked them to rate that. If it was me, I'd rather be closer to the mid 8s, 9s than I would be in the mediocre 7s. And then we looked at mood states. So specifically, I emphasized looking at fatigue levels and vigor levels. And so this is seeing the drop in fatigue over a season, which is oftentimes not that common, right? When you talk to a lot of athletes, the seasons are really long and they're tiring. And often fatigue goes up and vigor or energy drops, right? But that's not where you want your athletes to be at the end of the season, because often you're heading into more of your important games at the end, right? Or it's postseason or it's playoffs, right? But if their fatigue is really high and their vigor is really low, that's not ideal. And so we saw with the extension, fatigue dropped. 10 points on this scale is actually a standard deviation, just to give you some scale here. And then we saw the increase in vigor. We also had them doing reaction time tests. So this is, it's called the psychomotor vigilance task that's done in a lot of performance studies. And basically, it's a 10-minute test. You get target bullseyes at you at different intervals of time. And it's a really high signal load, so we get a lot of information in a short amount of time. They did it twice a day. And the reason why is because we want to look at the differences, say, from evening time to afternoon time. And what's also really interesting to see is not only, yes, do we see a faster speed or faster reaction time through extension, but do you see how much variability there is between testing times versus towards the end? That was really interesting to me to say that when an athlete's traveling and potentially playing games at different times, you don't want them necessarily reacting faster or slower just because they're playing a night game versus an afternoon game, right? If you can decrease that variability, and so it's as minimized as possible, I would say that would give you a better chance at consistency. Okay, so just to throw you a couple of basics here, a couple things to stress with your athletes. Number one is sleep duration. It is something that they can control. Know that what they think that they're getting is not what they're often getting objectively. So when you think you're telling me, Sherry, I'm getting, 7.5 hours, no, you're probably getting 7 or 6.5 hours. That's how I end up ballparking it, if we actually put on an objective monitor. But in general, my guidelines are I want athletes getting up at least to 8 hours of sleep. That's sort of my minimum. I mean, really, I would like an athlete to be in the 9 to 10 hour range. But if you have an athlete who's sleeping 5.5 hours or 6 hours, that's not realistic, right? And so, no, I don't say just jump them from 6 hours to 10. Take it gradually, half hour. We can all do a half hour more, right? Like DVR that show, or I don't know, we're all taking 30 minutes on the computer, right? So 30-minute increments gradually will be a good progression. Secondly, establish a consistent sleep schedule. A lot of athletes come to me and say, Sherry, my sleep sucks, and I don't understand why I'm waking up at night. And I ask, okay, well, what time are you sleeping? And they'll say, oh, I went to a party, so I was up at 1, and then the next night I tried to go back at 10, and then I went to bed at midnight. And they don't understand that the yo-yoing makes it really difficult for their body to anticipate sleep. Right? So just like you condition to perform, you also have to condition your body to sleep and prepare to sleep. You can't expect yourself just to jump into bed, fall asleep. It doesn't happen that way. Having a very consistent routine and bedtime and wake time is ideal. And just to throw this out there, I made this a couple of years back just to show a bunch of the pros and how much some of them do actually get in terms of their sleep. And some do really prioritize a significant number of hours. This was actually before we knew of some other ongoing activities, but he had said that he gets only 45 hours of sleep. This was a couple of years back, too. So I thought it was really funny when I pulled this back up again. This is interesting that people say, Sherry, okay, you're telling me to get more sleep. That means I have, an hour, 2 hours less in my day to do X, Y, or Z. But that's not really the case, because when you actually are more rested, you're more productive and you're more efficient in the time that you do have in the day. And this is one example. This was a study done in the Army, right? Where they took 4 different groups. A group that was getting 4 hours of sleep, 5 hours of sleep, 6 hours of sleep, and 7 hours of sleep. And they were doing target artillery, right? And so they were counting that in terms of production and efficiency. And basically what it showed is, sure, for two days, the 4-hour group would be more productive, but that's because they simply had more time in the day than, say, the 7-hour group. And after 2 days, they significantly declined. And this is the 4-hour group, the 5-hour, 6, and the 7-hour group. So sure, in 2 hours, you can be or 2 days, you can be more productive in the short term, but long term, that sleep debt's going to accumulate, and it's going to have a bigger impact than if you actually were well rested with a little bit more sleep. Yeah, kind of interesting. Okay, you want to make your bedroom like a cave. You want it really cool, quiet, and dark. I say blackout curtains are probably the best investment you can possibly make.
What is?
Blackout curtains. So think about how you sleep, say, in a hotel. Most people are like, oh yeah, it's like heaven, right? It's really dark, really cool, really quiet. That's how your sleep should be in theory every night. And so I do recommend blackout curtains. Some of my athletes even take it when they travel. So they will know they have the same blackout curtains and they'll be able to eliminate out of light, because often they won't realize that they're tossing and turning in the morning, and realize that in those morning hours they have much more fragmented rest, even if they're not going to recall all those awakenings.
What about like sleep mats? What do you think of those?
I mean that's great too. If that is something that you're comfortable wearing. Some people don't like having something physically on their face, but if that works for you, definitely. Keep it cool. I say use a fan, but also drop the AC. Typically set it, I'd say, like the hour before you're going to plan to go to sleep, so it can actually get cool enough. Hot stuffy rooms are not ideal. The cooler sometimes for some athletes is better, so I'd say starting them at around 70, 68, and then dropping it a couple of degrees every couple of nights to see what the perfect range is for them. Only sleep when you're tired. I get this a lot, I'm wide awake here. Well, that's not when you should be sleeping, because your body's going to tell you when you're tired, but you also have to be maintaining consistency, right? So you can't just yo-yo back and forth and expect that the quality is going to follow. You have to be working towards the consistency and also sleeping when you actually get tired. If you can't sleep, then get up, get out of bed, go do something else for 15 minutes, and then come back to sleep. You shouldn't be laying in bed for 2 hours, right? And fighting some of these insomnia symptoms, right?
What's your opinion on the backlit screens, and how do you advise with those? Or do you think it matters?
Yeah, I think that's next.
I'm sure that's good.
Thank you. Before you want to avoid the TVs, the laptops, the bright screens. And it's not only just because it's stimulating, but it's also really because the blue frequencies of light that are emitted from those devices can affect your melatonin release and prevent you from sleeping when you want to. And so minimizing that is preferable. I even throw in here, there's a small program called Flux that's free online that you can basically download, and it basically removes the blue frequencies at nighttime, so the screen dims down.
So the e-reading, obviously.
I know. I mean, the Kindles, I think in theory should be fine. People have asked about that, but the iPads, the bright screens are still gonna possibly.
So there's an app.
Flux, yeah.
Flux?
It's an ugly yellow.
Really?
It's not that bad.
Okay.
Yeah. But the point of this one is really to have a 20 to 30 minute routine before sleeping every night, right? Whether that's reading, whether that's stretching, whether that's journaling, having something to transition from the busyness of the day to winding down and relaxing to actually sleeping is key. And if athletes can tackle that, legitimately doing a 30-minute routine, be consistent with their bedtime wake time, honestly, that will solve many of their current sleep concerns or sleep question or problems, really, because when you tackle those 2 of the 3, then that usually gets some of the biggies. Okay, that is that. Touching on alcohol a bit, I mean, a lot of athletes are like, yeah, sure, it helps me pass out, and it does. Alcohol will help you fall asleep more quickly, but then it also reduces the quality of sleep at night, specifically the second half of the night. It's going to fragment your sleep a lot more. It can affect how much REM you get at nighttime, and often you'll feel more tired and exhausted when you wake up, even if you felt like you slept the same amount. I touch on this a bit because I think that sleep and nutrition are very much entwined. I don't want athletes going to bed hungry, so if they have an early dinner, I say, okay, grab a snack. I tend to say 50-50 protein carbs, so cheese and crackers, cereal and milk, something along those lines. I'm not even kidding you. I've seen NBA players roll out after games carrying like big boxes of spicy hot wings. Not ideal. You want to avoid the spicy, fried, tomato-based products. Can lead to acid reflux, and also just not ideal to be sitting there right in your stomach right when you're heading to bed. A lot of athletes need to stay well hydrated. Yes, do that during the day. Cut down the liquids when you head to the last 2 to 3 hours of the night. Keep a water bottle next to your bed so you don't have to get up, turn on all the lights, go walk around to get some liquids, and then come back to bed. And the timing of meals also has implications for that body clock, especially if you're crossing time zones too. And that's something that I look at because I think that timing those creates also the regularity for how they're going to be performing and how they're going to be sleeping when you're having to shift that body clock.
Do you, can you speak a bit more on or do you know the physiology of the carbohydrate intake? You have like different body composition strategies and how that affects sleep,
Yeah, I mean, where this was coming from was a lot of just trying to, in theory, provide the building blocks for like tryptophan and serotonin and then melatonin eventually. And making that more available than obviously grabbing for some of the fatty-based foods and the ones that are going to take longer to metabolize. All right, power naps. This is like a favorite of everyone. Yes, I do endorse and support power naps. Keep them short. As short as 10 minutes can actually give you a boost, but I usually say aiming for 20 to 30 is also ideal because it factors in how long it'll take someone to fall asleep. it'll give you that boost for 2 to 3 hours temporarily, but it's not supposed to be a substitute for adequate rest at nighttime. So no, I'm not saying get, a 6-hour night and then try to take like a 2-hour nap in the afternoon. Because you do want to be aware that it can cause sleep inertia. So the reason why athletes are waking up after 2-hour naps and saying, I feel like crap, is because they're waking up out of deep stages of sleep. And that's what we call sleep inertia. And that's when you feel more sluggish and more worn down. And that's not ideal if you have, a pro athlete got to go play a game and they're worn down and sluggish, right?
What gives you the headache when you wake up from a short nap?
Does that happen to you all the time?
The brain tumor.
That's the only reason I sometimes you don't know if you really fell asleep. Like, you fall asleep and you have like a headache kind of thing.
Oh, I have not heard of the headache as a common result, but you might be dehydrated. You might be, I'm not sure. You want to aim for the afternoons, and there's some studies out looking at even a short nap can improve, say, like sprint time. One thing I do want to point out is if athletes have trouble sleeping at nighttime, I would eliminate naps for these athletes. Because what happens is, for every waking hour, you're building up your drive to sleep, right? But if you take a nap, that drive to sleep is going to dip down, so that by the time you're going to go to bed at nighttime, it's not as high as if you didn't take that nap, right? But in general, it's really been helpful to give even athletes just short 10, 30-minute naps.
Do you have a recommendation as far as like before competition, as far as naps, like how, like should they not sleep 2 hours before, 3 hours?
Usually it's dictated by the game schedule in terms of when is like the pre-game meal, when is the meeting beforehand. I tend to like to make sure it's as close to as possible as game time, so you're not taking a nap 5 hours in advance of the game. Because we know that the research is suggesting 2 to 3 hours is the window time that you get to leverage that. But so it kind of depends on the case-to-case basis. Okay, this is also my favorite. You want to try caffeine nap? This can also give you kind of a double whammy, right? If you are so sleep deprived, who can fall asleep within 5 minutes? Yeah, there's probably, okay. Yeah, that's actually a quick sign to say how quickly you fall asleep is an indication of how sleep deprived you are. Really. If you can fall asleep within 5 minutes, you're in kind of this like red zone, danger, twilight zone. It should take you in theory more like 15 to 20 minutes to fall asleep. So if you can fall asleep so quickly that you can down a cup of coffee, fall asleep within 5 minutes, take a 20-minute nap, then when you wake up, the caffeine will kick in because it takes about 15 minutes to kick in, and you have the boost from the nap. So let's count it. Good strategy. All right, and lastly, touching on some sleep and technology monitors. So the last literally 3-4 years, I've seen this boom of wearable tech come out, right? We did not have any of these devices 5 years ago because at the time, 5 years ago, I was only using actigraphy. Actigraphy watches are kind of the gold standard accepted. We've been using it in the research field for decades, and basically it gives us objective measures of when an athlete is actually sleeping and when they're not, when they have fragmented sleep at nighttime and what the quality looks like. So this is just an example of what it looks like, and we kind of dissect that apart. In the last couple of years, there's been other consumer devices that have popped up. There's definitely pros and cons to all of these, and I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards on them. Know that all technologies have limitations. So yes, there's always going to be ways to trick some of these devices to looking like you're getting more or less sleep. But I do think that they're really great tools to at least give an athlete the ability to monitor and track their sleep objectively over time. Because with actigraphy, unless you download that data daily, it's hard for the athlete themselves to manage that, versus some of these consumer devices are very user-friendly. The UI is really easy. It's either on your app, right on your phone, and they can see that information, and there's this very big discovery phase for themselves. Because up until this point, most of them say, I don't know, Sherry, I pass out at midnight and I wake up at 8 a.m. I have no idea what happens at nighttime. Sometimes I feel good, sometimes I feel crappy, right? And when you enable them with a tool to actually monitor that, then they can see the differences from day to day, and now they have objective numbers, and as the competitive athletes that they are, they want to improve the numbers, right? So when their sleep quality is 7.2, obviously they want to get that up to the 8.5 that I'm trying to get them to, yeah? So we can talk about some of these later unless you guys have questions, but there's a bunch that are out on the market. Some have, died already. Others I know are emerging out. So These are a couple other ones that I hear and talk a lot. I would be careful about some of the claims that some of them make. There's some marketing features of saying that it's going to wake you at the most optimal time in your sleep cycle, right? That concept does hold true, that in theory it's better to wake up when you're not in deep sleep. But the only accurate way to do so is by accurately detecting the stage of sleep that you're in. And right now, we don't use in the clinical setting or in the research setting, besides using full polysomnography, which is full EEG hookup in the laboratory, that's the only way that we definitively determine what stage of sleep you're in. So some of the actigraphy-based motion sensors that you will see on some of the markets, if they make claims, that's something I would be careful of.
That's one of the main claims.
I know, because it's a great marketing feature, right?
I
Everyone wants to
guarantee
wake up
you
at
can
the
get
best time of your
Yeah.
sleep cycle, right?
Right, you can sleep 4 hours and still wake up rested, right? If you wake up the optimal time.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Well, you told me I'd go straight to REM, so I'm like, it's good, right?
So some people, if you're so sleep deprived, you can go straight into REM. That's true. But the only way, yeah. So I don't know. There's a lot we can talk about in terms of limitations. I do, again, in the bigger picture, I do really like integrating technology, and I like enabling athletes because it gives them the tools to improve their sleep. And again, as the objective numbers give or display to them, they can see the differences from day to day. But there's limitations.
Yeah, it certainly gives them insight in differentiating that
Yeah.
quantity versus quality,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's easy to measure that quantity usually, but they use some sort of technology to get
Yeah.
an idea how good that quality might be.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, again, you will think that you slept 8 hours, but what it's going to tell you is no, you got 7 hours and 15 minutes, right? And so being able to tease apart the objective numbers versus what you subjectively think is going on is also critical information, not just for the athlete, but I think for the coaches yourself, right?
I don't get anything from it, but I've used the Lark for years, and for significant, since as coaches, like for significant others, it's very helpful because then it's a silent, vibrating alarm that wakes you up, and so then my wife loves it. Except the other day when my arm was asleep and I overslept. That was kind of funny.
And I'd be happy to talk to you about lots of the different ones out there. I want to leave enough time for questions, so we can come back to that. This is just an example of like why I think this is important. This is when I was looking at some NHL guys. So we took 4 of them post-game. Yeah, they won, so they went out, and we knew that. But okay, they told me that they thought they were getting 6.3, 6.5, 5.5, 8.2 hours of sleep, which is all over the board. But objectively, when you look at that, look at this guy was getting 3.9 hours of sleep. This guy was getting 5.6. This guy was getting 5.8 hours of sleep. I can tell you, under 6 hours of sleep you're going to see a detrimental impact on how they perform and how they react. And then we can see things like how long did it take him to fall asleep? Well, here's a guy who definitely was taking longer than what is the norm. So is this guy dealing with anxiety and stress? Is he have a racing mind? Maybe it was just one night, but maybe it's not. We can see other numbers like how many times they're awake, and then efficiency. Sleep efficiency is important. I want my athletes to be up at 85% or higher in their sleep efficiency. That means the time they're asleep or the amount of time that they're in bed. Okay, so here's just to give you a basic framework. There's lots of details that fall under each of these categories, but just to give you a sense of how I would approach looking at how to integrate sleep into any type of team. One is to assess what the sleep habits and the sleep patterns are of a team, and that includes weekday sleep, weekend sleep, how is their sleep on the road, how is it when they're at home, evaluating their environments, looking at how they rate the quality of their sleep and other concerns that athletes have, because the reality is no 2 people are going to be the same. Everyone is going to have different lifestyle, different variables. A rookie is not the same as a vet. Different how they manage their time in their life, whether they have kids, whether they have other factors, are all going to play into that. Reassess at mid-season. You can't just you can't assess in the beginning and then not come back to that later down the road, because what you assess in the preseason is going to be very different than when you go into like halfway through a season, right? Sleep education is huge. A lot of athletes just have never looked at this before. They don't really know what to do. They don't understand that concept of sleep debt. They don't know what they should be aiming for, and none of them have a plan like you have many of your other athletes on nutrition plans or hydration plans or lifting plans, right? I utilize a lot of sleep logs, so this is actually giving a schedule and following up regularly using recovery logs. I know Phil's really good about using recovery logs here. So making sure that that's something that you partner together, so you have both their sleep information and data and the recovery logs side by side. I use sleep technology all the time because it gives us so much more data and information that we wouldn't otherwise have. I do think what an athlete tells me subjectively is critical, but then having the objective information to either back that up or telling me a different story that the athlete may not even be aware of themselves. And then I also develop performance profiles, because that's what this next one is let's just even take the reaction time profile, right? If this is over the course of the season and we know where an athlete is at their peak, if they come back next season and be tested, where are they? Are they right here? Or maybe they're right here, right? And then we know how far and how long it's going to take them in theory to get back to what their peak was at one point. And I looked at this doing profiling with, say, mood states, fatigue levels, and performance metrics too. But this is just one example of how I kind of integrate what happens at nighttime and overlay that with what happens during the daytime. All right, and you want to evaluate your home and travel schedules. I've seen some ridiculous schedules that allow athletes a window of, say, 6 hours of sleep, period, when they're on the road, because they're staying up late for film and then they're having to get up for breakfast really early. Allowing enough time, but also evaluating when flights are and how to combat the jet lag, because most teams don't have a strategy. They throw their athletes on a plane and say adjust to the new time zone, and then don't do anything when they actually get there. Optimizing travel accommodations, and then developing individual plans, because again, no two athletes are ever going to be the same, so you have to focus in on what their concerns and questions are and then address those. Screening for potential sleep disorders is also really critical because they're very common. Sleep apnea is very common, and specifically in a lot of football players, it's about 19% is what one study looked at in active players. All right, so this is my last slide. What I want to leave with you guys is just a couple of goals. Is for your athletes is 1, paying back that accumulated sleep debt. 2 is that they should be aiming for those 8 to 10 hours. 3 is that they should be aiming for 85% efficiency. And 4, they should be alert during the daytime. They shouldn't need to grab for the nap or have to grab for coffee.
Wow, just pulled out.
I like coffee. I like the taste.
I
can quit
coffee.
anytime.
But
I don't feel like I get a
staff
caffeine
and
rush, but I
coaches
like it.
And the management, what I want to encourage you guys to do is help create that framework so you can allow your athletes to be well rested. They can only do so much within the constraints of what you give them in terms of their scheduling or their training constraints, right? So I challenge you guys to walk away and look at how you enable or encourage your athletes to get better rest and recovery through sleep. And ask them about it. Most of them have just said they've never been asked about it, so it's about the duration and the quality. I think we have maybe a couple minutes, but I'll leave it, last for any questions.